Hello and welcome to this episode of the Millis Podcast, a show about ideas, books and events from the Christian intellectual scene in Australia and beyond. I'm your host, Simon Kennedy, and I'm the director of the Millis Institute and senior lecturer in the humanities at Christian Heritage College in Brisbane. I'm also a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Queensland. And I'm joined today by two distinguished guests who have edited a brand new book with Springer, a collection of essays addressing the relationship between science and religion in a very interesting way indeed. The book is Beyond Belief, Opportunities for Faith-Engaged Approaches to Climate-Change Adaptation in the Pacific Islands. As I said, it's published with Springer just in recent months. And the editors of this new volume join me today, Professor Patrick Nunn, who's Professor of Geography at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and Dr. Johannes Luetz, who is Senior Lecturer in the School of Social Sciences here with me at Christian Heritage College. Gentlemen, it's great to have you on. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, I wondered if you could introduce yourself a little bit more fulsomely, because as our listeners and viewers will quickly pick up, neither of you seem to hail from this part of the world. So I wonder if you can just give us a brief background on who you are and what kind of work you do in the academy or elsewhere. Or maybe I'll start with you, Patrick.
Okay, well, thank you, Simon. And my name is Patrick Nunn. I was born and bred in the UK and spent 25 years in the Pacific Islands working at the University of the South Pacific. I'm a geologist by training, a geographer, and for the last 20 years or so, really have focused on climate science to a large extent. And I suppose in a way, this book was an outcome of the marriage of my interests in climate science and my being in the Pacific Islands and becoming immersed in Pacific Island cultures and seeing synergies that hadn't really been seen by many people before, except for someone like Johannes.
Yes. That's very interesting. And Johannes, you hail from a different part of the world as well, and you've had been in various institutions. Do you want to give us a bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Simon, for having us both on the program. Yes, my name is Johannes Luetz. I am the research chair here at Christian Heritage College and also have a couple of adjunct appointments, one at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and one with Patrick's institution, University of the Sunshine Coast. Here in Queensland, and my background is a bit harder to put my finger on. It's not one place; it's several places. I was born in Germany, but have actually lived the majority of my life outside of Germany. So Germany is one element of my upbringing, but I was actually raised in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, and from a very young age have lived in very different contexts and have been able to appreciate how the worldviews that people have in the different places where they live in the world very much inform their thinking. And so later on, I also had the privilege of working with World Vision in the Asia Pacific region and have done some consulting with them. Here's a report that I worked on for about a year and based in Singapore. And that really opened my eyes to the realities of climate change being a building problem, both in the region but beyond, and the need to really integrate our worldview perceptions with our climate science. So that was my interest. I actually heard Patrick, we've been in touch over the years, haven't we, Patrick? Heard him speak at a symposium, I think it was, about 3 years ago at Griffith University. And giving a talk on this very matter of faith-engaged approaches and climate change adaptation, and thought, my goodness, this is so good. Patrick, let's do something with that. Let's see if we can, edit the book together, and drove up to the University of the Sunshine Coast and discussed with him the idea. And he will share more about that. But I just want to acknowledge quickly what a privilege it's been to edit this book with Patrick. He's a very accomplished person. You'd actually have to go online and look him up yourself. But he's a Nobel Prize winner with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it's been just an absolute joy and delight, Patrick, to have been in touch with you over the years and have now realized this project together. So maybe that's a bit of background on how the projects come together.
That's great. I guess I want to drill down a little bit more on that latter part of your response, Johannes. Can you gentlemen tell me more about the germination of the book? Obviously, there was a conference talk which triggered you, Johannes, to go and discuss this more with Patrick. But what drove you to put this volume together? What kind of things converged to make this an idea of importance for you?
Well, I can kick off. I think having been a climate scientist in the Pacific Islands for a long scientific arguments to people in the Pacific for adapting to climate change or the effects of climate change, like sea level rise, the more it became clear that that kind of message really didn't get very much traction in the Pacific, because people's worldviews were really informed largely by their spiritual beliefs. And I deliberately don't use the term religious beliefs, but their spiritual beliefs. And I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of people in the Pacific Islands, while many of them will pay lip service to science, really see the world in terms of a place that is spiritually controlled, and where change is spiritually initiated, and where responses must be spiritually filtered, if you like, through people's worldviews. So, you know, it became clear to me, and this is my turn to praise Johannes, you know, that scientific agendas were not being very effective in the Pacific. And as a result of that, I would go and talk to Australian Aid, as it was then, and other donor organizations, and I'd say, look, you know, your secular attempts at intervening for climate change adaptation in the Pacific are not working. You need to engage with people's spiritually driven or spiritually underwritten worldviews. And for the most part, people's eyes would just sort of go up to the ceiling when I suggested things like this. So look, when I met Johannes, and I found someone who actually shared my understanding of the importance of engaging with people's worldviews rather than trying to trample over them, I think that really motivated me to want to collaborate with him.
Yeah, fantastic. That's really helpful. It's a really interesting premise. I mean, if I was to summarize what you're trying to do with this book, and I appreciate the distinction you're making between religion and spirituality. So if I use the word religion, you'll have to forgive me. But it's another shorthand. So in this book, it seems that you're looking to explore how spirituality can connect with science to overcome extant barriers in moving toward action on environmental issues, particularly in the Pacific region. I'm guessing that this methodology or this way of thinking can actually help in other regions as well. But your larger point, I think, is that religion, and especially Christianity, is an inexorable part of life and experience of the people in the Pacific Island region. And so secular approaches seem to fall short in various ways due to them, maybe people being insensitive or ignorant of this. Why do you think keying into the points of contact between science and spirituality are important, particularly in the Pacific Islands in relation to addressing something like climate change?
Will you take that, Patrick?
No, I think it's your turn.
Your turn, Johannes.
Yeah, my turn. I think in a general sense, what we're doing too is people generally familiar with the iceberg conceptualization of culture and worldview, and we see a small part sticking out above the water and assume that's all there is to it, when the majority of the iceberg is actually hidden beneath the surface of the water. And I think this is a helpful way to remind ourselves that much of what we see is actually incomplete. There's a whole lot more to the picture than what we actually see. And we need to engage with that unseen bulk of spiritual persuasion or worldview orientation that really informs what people believe and how they will engage with this issue. So I think in my view, there's two ways one can approach this. One from a Christian perspective, seeing what happens in the world through more of a theological sense, and then bringing science into that to actually inform that. Or on the other side, the scientists are seeing this as purely a scientific issue, but actually bringing in the worldview part and bringing actually two aspects into a bigger picture framing of the issue that much more helpfully and much more effectively allows climate change adaptation to become sustainable and to actually go the distance because of the many problems and issues that are building there. Do you want to add or elaborate to that, Patrick?
Only to say that I think we overstate sometimes the importance of science because we all have scientific training and an innate appreciation of science. But I don't think you need science in places like the rural areas of Pacific Islands to adapt to climate change. You know, if the sea level is rising, then obviously you have to move up the slope. Now, it doesn't require science to do that, but it does require an engagement with your worldview. And if your worldview is spiritually or religiously dominated, then clearly the decision to move has to be filtered through that worldview. So, I mean, let me just add to what Johannes said very well, which is that the turning point for me came when I became sufficiently fluent in the Fijian language to be able to understand what people were discussing in rural village communities in the Pacific, where I've spent an awful lot of time, you know, living with people in these communities. And, you know, it came to a point where I realized that they were very polite to scientists who came in who talked about the science of climate change, particularly if they thought that money might be coming, flowing to them as a result of that. But once the scientists had left the room, the conversation really all came back to God. Why is God doing this to us? What does God want us to do in response to this? And then it just became completely clear to me that that science was not an influencer of decision making in those kinds of communities, and that prayer was considered, for example, far more powerful than any kind of scientific rationalization.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating, and you have a you couldn't say it's a unique perspective, strictly speaking, but it's a very unusual perspective because you've lived in the Pacific Islands for so many years. So I guess I'll direct this question to you, Patrick. What makes the Pacific Islands particularly promising for this kind of thinking and research, do you think?
I think the fact that, you know, probably 95% of people in the Pacific Islands are Christian.
Right.
So there is a lot of common ground in terms of a belief system. So I think the potential for aligning spiritual or religious messaging with adaptation imperatives for climate change is huge. And I have a good friend who wasn't persuaded to contribute to our book, unfortunately, James Bhagwan, who is the chair of the Pacific Conference of Churches, which is an ecumenical Christian organization in the Pacific. And when he was a senior minister in the Methodist Church of Fiji, he spent a lot of time thinking about the alignment of Christian messaging that could go out to the pulpits in various communities across the Pacific, the alignment of that messaging with climate change adaptation imperatives. And it's not trickery. You know, the alignment in the Bible is very clear. You know, it's all about stewardship. It's all about caring for the earth, and this is a basic message of sustainability as we talk about it in science. So the alignment doesn't have to be forced, but sometimes the alignment has to be localized. It has to be made relevant to particular communities in particular places.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And Johannes, did you have any insights on this question? Like, from your perspective, are the Pacific Islands uniquely promising, or is this something that you've seen in other parts of the world as well that would help the conversation along?
Yeah, look, I haven't lived in the Pacific in the way that Patrick has, but I've lived in plenty of other countries of the world. I think 12 or 13
Yeah, right.
to hit on all the 6 continents. Antarctica is where I haven't lived, and I don't plan to ever. But yeah, based on all this life experience, I absolutely concur with what Patrick has already stated, that worldview or spirituality is deeply ingrained in people's views of the world. I mean, this was so back growing up in West Africa, where disease, sickness, malaria was explained by witch doctors, or which is operating in the area. That's what really happened. So never mind what the doctors were doing.
Yeah.
And so this is very much the background reality that people bring to the table, and I think that's often underappreciated by people living in countries of the West, like in Europe or even Australia. So I think we've got two different perspectives sometimes, whereas in the Pacific and elsewhere, people naturally assume that things are first and foremost based on God's design. Here in Australia, it's perhaps the last thing people would agree with and be comfortable with. So it's all basically science apart from any sort of consideration of God's involvement, which again brings us back to this importance of the interdisciplinary nature of this. We don't want to have the one at the expense of not having the other. I think it's bringing those two perspectives into the conversation is what's important. And I think that holds true for the Pacific as for many other countries in the world where we just see this perspective insufficiently integrated into the wider policy and research discourses.
Yeah, and it strikes me generally that a lot of the, I guess the international policy issues that something like the UN deals with, and along with other NGOs, all of those NGOs in the UN and so on are based in Europe or in North America or in Australia, and our perspective is probably quite different to most of the rest of the world in that regard. So I think that this is a really interesting aspect of what you're doing in this book. So thank you for your responses. It's very, very interesting. This is a varied and big book. It's difficult to summarize the content, but I wonder if you could both share, and I'll start with Johannes perhaps, some of the highlights of the book. I know you can't choose favorites as editors. That's not what I'm asking you to do. But maybe you can find a way to give listeners and viewers some insights into what they'll find when they pick this up, or if they search it on the database. Give them a feel for the content, Johannes. And then I'll come to you, Patrick, after that, if you want to share some as well.
For that opportunity, Simon. I think the book, I've got a copy here.
Very good.
A combination of, you introduced it before as containing essays. I think it's more than that. It actually contains a number of empirical studies as well that were conducted where actual data.
I'm using a very humanities biased approach to my phrasing there. I'm sorry.
That's all good and all fine, and essays isn't wrong. That combination of some conceptual chapters which approach these issues more from a faith or theologically informed perspective, as well as empirically gathered and analyzed data in the Pacific, which makes this book unique in that it is informed by both very theological approaches and thinking, but also by people who actually live and work in the area and have gone out and conducted interviews and have analyzed those interviews and have synthesized these perspectives and have very helpfully brought out a number of very important conclusions from these investigations. Perhaps personally, I mean, you mentioned we can't have favorites, and that's very true. We did, both of us, author some chapters as well. Yes. So that might not qualify them as favorites in how I'm presenting them, but that gives me an opportunity perhaps to speak to some of the contents that I've had some involvement with myself as an author in my role as a co-author, in addition to my role as a co-editor. And one of the chapters, it's chapter 18 in the book, Christianity, creation and the climate crisis. Eco-theological perspectives, I think is how we ended up calling it, is quite interesting for me in the sense that it actually represents an attempt to explain how theological orientation might actually inform people's engagement or lack of engagement around our sustainability issues. So we have a number of paradigmatic perspectives which we present in the chapter. My co-author Richard Leo and myself, there it is. Yeah, thank you, Simon. Those 5 perspectives. And here we see how theology very much informs whether or not people will engage with these issues and what sort of alignment they will be comfortable with based on their theological background. So I thought, I learned a lot in researching this and studying this deeply and writing this up with Richard, and I think it was an attempt, at least for me, to try and explain to myself why aren't some Christians in countries like Australia or the US, why aren't they engaging more with this issue, which has been really puzzling to me for many, many, many years. And I think now I've finally been able to understand, at least from a sort of conceptual background perspective, why, theologically speaking, that makes sense based on people's theological persuasions to either engage more fully, actively, or more passively, or actually perhaps even to potentially oppose engagement. And so that was, I don't know if I want to call it a highlight, but it was a great learning for me. And I think it closed a circle for me in my own understanding of why that's the case. Patrick, over to you.
Well, I can build on that. I think in Australia, we tend to separate belief and science, if you like, or belief and action around things like climate change, whereas I think in the Pacific, they tend to be all part of one. And look, for me, having thought about this for a decade or more before we actually got the book together, I think one of the things that I realized was that we didn't have any good case studies of, demonstrating the depth to which spiritual beliefs permeated Pacific Island people's worldviews. And I think in this book, you've got a number of great case studies. Chapter 3 on Malaita in Solomon Islands. It's a great example of how everyday life, decisions around in everyday life are just informed by people's spiritual views. And even the one from Papua New Guinea, chapter 8 by Kylie and Laurel, talking about people's belief in the end times in amongst Papua, about market vendors in Madang, and we've got examples from Fiji, from Kiribati, from several other parts of the Pacific Islands. So I think for the first time, we've got a number of very compelling case studies that talk about the degree to which people's everyday actions are informed by their spiritual beliefs. And that really does present a challenge for science, because I think the optimal way forward is, as Johannes has said, and Simon, you have said, it is actually to marry science with people's spiritual or faith-driven beliefs or worldviews. But it's actually not as easy as it sounds in some places. There has to be a way of integrating this. I don't think we really got very far into that question in this book. I think we really have presented a platform for future action. So hopefully, 10 years from now, Johannes and I can get together and produce a follow-up to this.
Great. No, thank you for that. That's a very helpful overview. And the case studies are very interesting. Like you said, they range over different nations, different parts of the Pacific. It's interesting how also different aspects of theology and belief make an appearance. Eschatology is a really interesting one. And the impact of eschatology on public policy is an interesting issue to me as well. But I guess to close the interview, I'd be interested in you exploring this question with you. What are some ways that Christian scholars might take the conversation forward? You've talked about how this is a platform, Patrick. How would you see potentially Christian scholars, people who are informed and maybe more sensitive to these issues, How could they take the conversation forward from this point, do you think?
I think in an Australian context, as in many richer countries that help the Pacific and want to see them adapt successfully to climate change, I think it's really a question of trying to persuade decision makers that a secular worldview is not helpful in a Pacific Island context and can in many cases be maladaptive. So I think that the Christian voice and the religious voice in Australia could be directed towards questions or towards issues like this. You know, I sometimes think in Australia that we tend to sort of put religion, you know, on the back burner while we deal with everything else on the front burner. But in the Pacific, it's different. And I would love to see more Australian Christians and others sort of standing up and saying, our beliefs are more than mere beliefs. They are a guide to practical action in places like the Pacific Islands. And if you want to help the Pacific Islands, you need to understand that rather than just pretend that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, helpful. That's helpful. Johannes, do you have any thoughts on how people of faith and Christians might take the conversation forward, building on the platform that we see here?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly concur with your views, Patrick. I think there is a great opportunity to take this forward. And as you said, Patrick, this might have been just a sort of a groundbreaking first step, really trying to grapple with these issues. And the hope is that we'll see many more volumes and studies arising from this engagement. I think there are possibly areas for engagement as well in areas of interfaith engagements, because more typically people will have worldviews or spiritual understandings that aren't purely one religion or one other religion, but they're informed by a whole range of different backgrounds and perspectives. So I think the area of interfaith spirituality and sustainability would be a very fascinating area to explore and to take forward in future studies. Yeah, those are my thoughts, I think, on what more one could do. But I think coming back to the whole point, it is just simply to now work with these realities and see that they actually attract some policy attention and actually get some traction, that we need the one with, we don't just need the one with or the other, but the one with the other, in the same way that someone might fall off the horse on either side. I think we don't want to have just science or just theology. I think, again, bringing the two together will be helpful, and seeing that taken forward by duty bearers and policy makers and decision makers, including in the way that grants are allocated and money is given to fund climate change adaptation projects in the Pacific, would be a great outcome if that was to have been supported by the book.
Well, the book is Beyond Belief. It's published with Springer 2021, this year in 2021. I would encourage people to go and get a copy, except that maybe only the wealthiest among us could afford a copy, which is typical with Springer books. But for people who have access to databases and so on, this will be available widely on your university databases and so forth. Gentlemen, thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts. I'm looking forward to seeing where this area of research and scholarship goes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon and Patrick. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.